This lorry is carrying the most valuable substance the British ever made. We had to make it because the Americans betrayed us. We were able to make it because a spy betrayed them. Now, 50 years on, the men responsible tell their secret story for the very first time.
I was in the middle of the Atlantic coming home and kept getting snippets from other passengers that some bomb had gone off. I was very, very shaken, and I couldn't talk to anyone for obvious reasons. All of us at that time in discussion, no one believed that the bomb would be dropped on an inhabited area. They thought it would be dropped on some naval base or something, and it would be enough to demonstrate that it was bad.
In this moment of solemn triumph, General MacArthur speaks.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
Stampeding to the nearest phone box, reporters spread the news to a waiting world. From the east coast to the west, Americans' millions had only been waiting the official word to go completely wild.
Most people believed 2 atomic bombs had ended the Second World War and assumed they were totally American weapons.
The United States would not, I think, have worked on the atomic bomb during the Second World War if it had not been for British input and British encouragement. They agreed that they would share the technology during the war. It was part of that famous trunkload of secrets that was sent over here in the hopes of exchanging the information with us and encouraging us to use our vast industrial capacity to help fight the war.
British scientists had been the first to show that an atomic bomb was possible, and many of them had played crucial roles in the top-secret Manhattan Project, which built the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. When the war ended, Britain naturally expected to continue in the atomic partnership with America, but the government was in for a rude awakening.
The Atomic Energy Act, for example, said that there would be no sharing of any information about nuclear technology with any other country. This was a cruel thing to do, and I think it says a great deal about how important nuclear weapons and a nuclear monopoly was to the United States at that time.
For Britain, the price of winning the Second World War had been high. The country was on its knees. After 6 years of suffering and privation, the people had handed the task of reconstruction to a new Labour government, headed by Clement Attlee.
We alone of all the nations went through 2 great wars. We're still alone. For that fight, we put everything in that we had. We sacrificed all our wealth overseas. We converted all our industry. And that is why we are left in this position today. The only way out is by greater output of all the things that we need. And that means harder work.
Even as the Prime Minister asked the country for yet more sacrifice, he gathered senior members of his new government at London's Shelmex House and made a decision so secret that not even the full cabinet was informed. Shaken by America's rejection, nervous of the new Soviet presence in Europe, Attlee argued that without atomic weapons, Britain would be left isolated and powerless. But if Attlee wanted a bomb, he would have to secure the services of one very special man.
Sir William Penney, the only British scientist at the atom bombing of Nagasaki. Britain's leading atomic scientists were then working in partnership with the Americans. But after 1945, they had to work alone.
Top security. Pathé cameraman and reporter John Parsons went out under sealed orders to Airfield X to greet Britain's atomic expert, Dr. Penney, the man with a load of secrets. Dr. Penney is important.
And now, Dr. Penney, what is your next move? Well, I hope to have my summer holiday.
And where will you be going for that?
Oh, I'm not quite sure yet.
He was very dubious as to whether he was going to do atomic energy because he'd been offered a chair in Oxford. And we had a week's holiday, and when it was the only time we really ever talked was whether he should do the job in Oxford, which he would have loved, or whether in duty bound he ought to go and make bombs.
This way a little. What does your wife think about it, Doctor?
Oh, I think she agrees with me.
Well, it's not a very nice thing to happen to have an atomic bomb dropped on you, is it, or around you?
A key figure in the making of America's bomb, Penney had been sent to Nagasaki to make measurements on the size of the blast. He had been one of the first to see the grim reality of what atomic bombs could do. But he also understood how the bombs had changed the world.
I think it was entirely a sense of duty that made him do it, that he thought that England should have it.
So Penney set up shop in an existing weapons research establishment at Fort Halstead on the Downs south of London. His first problem would be recruitment.
At the end of the war, having done a spell in Washington, came back and the question arose what I was going to do, which was answered by a call to go and see a Dr. Penney at Fort Halstead.
They told me nothing at all. They just said, we're transferring you to a job in London, would you like to go? And I said, I'm quite happy to go. I didn't ask what. I knew it'd be something on electronics, because that's what I was working on, electronics. And I was quite happy to move anywhere at that stage, especially moving back to London.
Recruiting was rather difficult, and it took an awful lot of time. I spent a lot of time on interviewing boards at that time. The real problem was you couldn't tell the candidate what you wanted him for. And a lot of people weren't prepared to take you on trust.
Well, secrecy never worried me because I went straight from college straight to working on radar and took the Official Secrets Act at that stage. And after that, everything I did was secret. My wife, when I first met my wife-to-be, the only question I asked was whether her father was a member of the Communist Party, and she said no. And so I asked her, oh, that's all right, I can marry you then.
Even transistors hadn't been invented yet, but Challen's and Howe's were being asked for complex electronic circuits. It was time they found out why.
We were upstairs, and we heard someone come up the stairs, and we saw this tubby chap with a sports coat on which had patches on the elbow, and we thought, general workers arrived. And he didn't say anything, and we just what we wanted to do, and he started asking us questions. He asked us what we were doing, and we told him, and it turned out this was Bill Penney. So we started asking him questions. And he said, well, what you're actually doing is you're developing the firing circuit for detonators. And so we said, well, why the 5.6 kV? Well, that was the voltage that the Americans used. And so we realised then that what we were doing was trying to copy the American design of atomic weapons.
But the Americans had been careful. They had made sure that Penney took away only a tiny fraction of the secrets of the bomb's design. The task of working out the rest would come to plague him. But he had seen the first test at Trinity, and he was well aware of the most basic principles.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
To make a nuclear explosion go, all you have to do is assemble a sufficient amount of fissionable metal, uranium or plutonium. There was a joke at Cambridge in the early years of the war that the war could be ended easily by taking individual bricks of uranium-235, putting them in little packages and mailing them to Hitler. And as they slowly were assembled on his desk, eventually you would have a critical mass. It would blow up, and that would be the end of Hitler. It's not quite that simple, but that's the basic idea.
It's not quite that simple, because the material Penney would have to assemble was plutonium. And plutonium doesn't exist in nature. You have to make it, atom by putting ordinary uranium into a nuclear reactor. As the Americans had found out, the size of that job was almost unimaginable.
In 1945, the Manhattan Project was comparable in industrial investment, in scale of operations, in number of people employed to the U.S. automobile industry in 1945. It was a vast effort. It cost $2 billion, which in modern dollars would certainly be equivalent to the cost of sending the first man to the moon.
During the war, Britain had very nearly run out of ammunition, a crisis that could have been fatal. Disaster had been averted by the inspired leadership of an ICI engineer, Christopher Hinton. He would take on the job of turning uranium ore into plutonium.
The reason that Hinton wanted this job was partly because he was a very public-spirited man who had been doing war work for so long, and this was almost like a continuation of his service to the country. And also, I think, because he didn't very much want to go back to ICI. Though he had a brilliant career at ICI, he wasn't altogether happy there. There was a rather snobby culture in ICI in those days, in which, for some reason or another, engineers were rated rather lower than managers and salespeople, and he always felt that the engineers were undervalued. There was a very strong class division.
Hinton's success during the war drew on his extraordinary ability to spot and nurture talent, whatever the background. Now he called on his most trusted protégés.
My old boss during the war rang up and said, "Have you been back to the old firm to fix up where you're going to sit when you get back?" And I said, "No, but I have told them that I'm going to see them in the middle of February, come after my holiday." He says, "Well, don't go down there anymore. Don't speak to anybody." And I said, "What's all this about?" He said, "Well, I can't tell you. It's hush hush. Just don't bother, and just don't do anything until I ring again."
Hinton was used to driving at speed, and he got his lieutenants there, so he hadn't got to build a totally new organisation. He got his key figures there, and they were all people who were used to going out and getting done, and getting things to time for Hinton.
A far from glamorous base was chosen. At Risley in Lancashire, in the heart of the heavy industries Hinton knew he would need.
About a week later he phoned and said, "It's all been fixed up." I said, "What's been fixed up?" "Well," he said, "meet us all at Risley next Monday morning." I said, "Well, what's it all about?" "It's top secret. Don't ask any question. I just turned up on Monday and you'll find out. Hinton's got an interesting proposition to talk about."
There were 14 or 15 of us that day, and Hinton told them that the project was to build plants.
He then introduced us to Gins, who he explained was the only one amongst us who knew anything about reactors. So we sat and listened to the most exciting off-the-cuff lecture by Gins about problems we'd never heard of before.
Armed with only the scantest information gleaned in America, Gins gave the 14 men of the British programme the most basic lecture.
You have a material called uranium, which you've all heard about, which has 92 electrons. It's a bit difficult to imagine, but they go round in a series of rings in an orderly fashion round the nucleus. But instead of having 92 protons in the middle, it has a total of 238 neutrons and protons. And the mystery to me as an engineer is what holds them together. Because positive charges ought to burst apart. But the physicists tell me, and I have to accept this, there is what they call the strong force, which somehow, when they get close together, instead of flying apart, they bond together. Now this nucleus gets a bit uncomfortable, and I always think of it as having indigestion. And occasionally it does a burp and shoots out a couple of particles. If
As the lecture went on, the engineers realized they were being asked to use chain reactions to release the huge amounts of energy stored in the nucleus, according to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared.
You have a tremendous...
And as Jins explained, that energy could be released in two ways.
Here, you might be able to hold this reaction exactly in control. So you have the potential here for an enormous release of energy. And this, the scientists realized, firstly, here was a possible source of energy of the future, and here, unfortunately, was a possible source of the most devastating bomb the world had ever known.
By the time lunchtime came, I was dazzled with all the new science fiction, whatever.
They were all, I think, pretty dumbfounded and awestruck because it was such different. They were used to chemical plants, but this obviously wasn't a chemical plant, and it was so mysterious.
Hinton drew up a punishing schedule for his men, then looked for an isolated site for his plutonium factory. He settled for Windscale on the Cumbrian coast.
Well, Hinton in his first day told us that he promised to supply enough plutonium for the first bomb by early 1952. And he said that date would be nearly impossible.
Hinton said, we haven't time to build a pilot plant. We must build a full-scale plant straight away. So this vast building was built from scratch, from this lab-scale model. And the thing that was particularly brave about that was that once the process began and the radioactive material was beginning to go through the process, it would be impossible for anybody ever to go into the building inside it to make any alterations. It had to be right first time.
Windscale was far and away the most difficult factory to build. It was huge. The piles were about 70 feet high. It was in a building that was about 120 feet high. It had a chimney that was 400 feet high. The chemical plant building was 200 feet high, and it had a 200-foot chimney on the top of it. This was the scale of things. I had never seen plants of this size in my life before.
Hinton was going to cool his immensely hot reactors with air, a decision that provoked a furious row. One thing that was known about the secret American reactors was that they were cooled by water. Hinton had rejected that. He didn't have access to the vast water supplies needed, and anyway, he didn't believe the design was safe.
He was in conflict with his bosses in the Ministry of Supply, who were very angry with him because they said, we have got to have this material for the bombs. We know this is the way it can be done, and they were practically prepared to discipline him for unruly behavior, for mutiny or something, because he would not do as he'd been directed to do.
What Hinton's theoretical people hadn't realized was that as cooling air flowed through the reactor and out of the chimneys, dangerously radioactive fission products might be dispersed across the countryside. Hinton decided there would have to be filters, but the chimneys were already half built, and with no room in the schedule for any delay, the huge filter galleries had to be hastily designed, then built 400 feet up in the air.
The Windscale piles were the bottleneck. They were the bottleneck to the whole of the British nuclear program, and therefore all the pressure, all the interest, all the urgency was focused on these two huge piles.
Hinton was racing against the clock, starved of men, resources, and vital technical information. Attlee decided on a last desperate attempt to persuade the Americans to help. But his trip would open a can of worms. The Americans were horrified to discover that Britain was even considering making her own bomb. They threatened to withhold financial aid if Britain persisted. Well aware that his country would starve without American loans, Attlee found that behind the smiles he was suddenly being blackmailed.
We were saying we're going to confiscate your entire supply of uranium ore, cut you out of any possible decision about using these weapons, and really not share any important information, because in fact the Atomic Energy Act in the United States forbade sharing any crucial nuclear weapons information with any other country. So at every level we were simply saying, like it or lump it, or we won't share any money with you at a time when you're in very serious near bankruptcy conditions.
Attlee returned empty-handed, more convinced than ever that he must have an atomic bomb, with a Union Jack on top of it.
The density of a solid ball of metal by squeezing it hard enough with explosives, and that's what this device did. It was a ball of metal and a ball of explosives that squeezed the metal to criticality.
The hard bit is to make a huge ordinary explosion go inwards with incredible precision. It's called implosion. The key figure who'd solved many of the problems of this technique in America was one of the British contingent, Klaus Fuchs. A German emigre, he had fled the Nazis and worked in Britain before the war. Now Penney had him rushed back from America in an RAF bomber to take his place at the centre of the British effort.
Fuchs's great strengths were that he was an extremely versatile physicist who had very strong abilities in theoretical physics and was a very fluent and able mathematician, and who seemed able to generate new ideas in a great variety of different fields.
He was a very quiet man, but perhaps if I could give a little flavour to him, I always remember we used to have a Friday evening in the officers' mess on the site here, and I remember my wife coming and sitting down beside me and saying to me, bearing in mind that I couldn't dance, that Klaus was magnificent when he tangoed.
But Fuchs was about to demonstrate that his versatility went way beyond the dance floor.
There was some information coming out that there was a Soviet bomb program. So we launched a program of airborne detection in early September of 1949. The planes turned up samples with, indeed, plutonium on the filters. And that made it clear that there had been a Soviet test, and even made it clear what size the test had been, what type of bomb it had been. All that could be determined because of the debris from the fallout from the bomb. But President Truman was not a technically educated man, and he had great contempt for the Soviet Union in general. And he refused to believe that the Soviets could have tested a bomb. There was a great deal of discussion in with his staff of whether this might not be a reactor that had blown up because it was badly designed and so on. And when the Atomic Energy Commissioners came to the president and said it was indeed a Soviet bomb, like our Fat Man bomb, he insisted that they sign a paper. They put their names on paper that they believed this to be true.
Before America's Congress, President Truman makes the most momentous speech since the death of Franklin Roosevelt. He declares political war on Soviet Russia. In American eyes, Britain is no longer the bulwark against communist expansion.
If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
It soon became clear how the Russians had managed to catch up so quickly. Klaus Fuchs was arrested for spying. He admitted he had systematically given the Russians the detailed secrets of the implosion bomb. But the Russians weren't the only ones to benefit.
Fuchs is often castigated as having passed information to the Soviet Union. It's overlooked that in the very nature of things, he was working for the British and passed the information to Great Britain.
Strange enough, I gathered most of my information about the implosion system from Klaus Fuchs. He used to come and lecture here regularly on the implosion system until, of course, he was arrested.
Fuchs had spied for Britain, the country that now jailed him, but the arrest of such a key figure was a body blow to the British programme. And at Windscale, a problem was looming. By now they had worked out what was supposed to happen in a reactor.
In this lecture hall, the fundamentals of atomic energy are explained. The core is a block of very pure graphite pierced with holes in which uranium rods are placed, here enlarged. When enough rods are placed thus close together, a spontaneous nuclear fire begins. The chain of atom splitting, or burning, created by the neutrons will in time consume all the uranium-235 contained in the uranium fuel and will convert some of the remainder to the concentrated nuclear fuel, plutonium.
That was the theory, but the moment of truth was approaching.
I didn't have a day off for 12 months. And when I say day, I'm talking about Saturdays and Sundays as well. When uranium was loaded and a measurement was necessary, it didn't matter what time of the day or night, I was in here with my second in command, taking the necessary measurements to go up to criticality.
If the reactor was going to produce enough plutonium for a bomb, the chain reaction would have to start when a very specific amount of uranium fuel had been loaded. Speculation about how much it would actually take was growing.
Well, the forecast was that the critical size should be around about 42 tons of fuel loaded.
All the people in the know thought that the critical size would be around 40 tons, and we had a sweepstake in the certainly in the laboratories that I was working in, I think probably in the whole of the site. And all the people who thought they knew about it were around about 40 tons, but the character who won was somebody who knew nothing about the reactor, who just picked a figure out of the air of 100 tons, and he won the sweepstake.
And in fact, it turned out to be 102 tons. And this meant, of course, that the plutonium output from the reactors was going to be very considerably reduced.
In fact, it looked as though the reactor wasn't going to make any plutonium at all. Bill Penney had assumed Hinton would produce the plutonium and also handle the tricky business of forming it into a perfect sphere, the core for the heart of the bomb. But with Windscale in trouble, Penney realized he would have to set up an entirely new facility to make the core himself.
We looked all over the place for a place to use instead of Fort Helston. That was rather fun because I used to be taken on these various trips to look at always, of course, old aerodromes because of the hangars that could be used as workshops. And this was a nice little house in Aldermaston that they built for us. We moved in with the water streaming down the walls. I didn't like that. I thought it was a bit damp.
Preparing to handle plutonium, Penney again had to live with the frustrating knowledge that the information he so desperately needed existed across the Atlantic. He shamelessly pumped visiting scientists for information.
We used to have an extraordinary number of foreigners. But as I had to do the cooking and the washing up, you see, they got on with the business while I got on with the dishes. Rationing at that time was very tight. Hell, really, you got the car out and you rushed down to the butcher and you went in the back door of the butcher's and so help, you see. My husband's bringing home anything up to 5 people for dinner. Can you do anything for me?
Armed with some new information from Penney's dinner parties, but still largely in the dark, the Aldermaston team struggled to work out safe ways of handling the most dangerous of metals.
Plutonium is a silvery grey metal, but it oxidizes very rapidly in air, particularly moist air, and produces a very fine oxide. If this is inhaled and it lodges in the lung, or is ingested and lodges in parts of other parts of the body, or gets into the bloodstream through a wound, it can cause serious problems leading to cancers.
We knew that these materials were dangerous. The only one thing that we didn't really know with any certainty was how much and over what period. Because, you know, you can take a reasonable amount of something like strychnine in the body, and once you may feel pretty darn ill, you won't necessarily die. There was open doors which were leading into a big area which was serviced by people in frog suits, airline suits. They were called frog suits because they looked very much like frogmen. This was a very highly active area, the entry and exit by which could only be thorough controlled by ventilation systems and corridors.
Aldermaston was perfectly safe for the moment. they hadn't yet seen an ounce of plutonium.
A vast rally filled Liverpool Sports Stadium to give Mr. Winston Churchill a tremendous welcome.
In 1951, Churchill was returned to power. He was amazed and delighted to discover that Attlee had secretly spent £100 million on an atomic bomb programme, and he quickly set a test date for October '52. But the confident tone of the secret film he commissioned was misleading.
At Chatham in June 1952, the escort carrier Campania prepares to sail for Western Australia as flagship of a special squadron. And with Campania is HMS Tracker, a landing ship carrying some of the more precious equipment, like this gleaming caravan that houses one of the high-speed cameras. There, within sight of Nelson's Victory, Campania takes on the rest of her cargo, a brood of boffins. Physicists and mathematicians, chemists and botanists, doctors and engineers, each with a positive role to play in this great experiment.
The tight deadlines meant the boffins had to load their equipment and start the long journey south. But at this stage, their cargo was far from dangerous. With only 3 months to go, the crucial nuclear components still didn't exist. As the convoy prepared to set sail for the test site, £100 million and Britain's military reputation were riding on an operation that seemed doomed to failure. After months of diplomatic effort, it was agreed that Britain's first atomic test, codenamed Operation Hurricane, could take place off the northwest coast of Australia. The calm of the previously uninhabited Monte Bello Islands was shattered by an advance party of sappers, laying the foundations for a massive scientific effort.
This is their last chance to fish. After the explosion, all fishing will be banned because of the danger of contamination.
But there would be no explosion unless Windscale could solve her problems. The engineers now knew why the reactors weren't working. Too many neutrons were escaping, but a redesign would take years to complete. In desperation, they asked Tom Toohey if he could find a way to get rid of some aluminium from the fuel elements to cut down neutron absorption.
And this meant unloading the 102 tons, clipping 1/6 of an inch of aluminium off every fin, of which there were 14 on each of 36,000 fuel elements, which meant we had to do about 500,000 fins. And one of our engineers devised a little machine whereby you could place this on a rack and turn it round, and you made a stroke like that, clipped your fin, turned it round, clipped another, turned it round, clipped another, and we managed to get the whole 500,000 fins off, as I say, in 3 weeks, and the fuel back into the reactor.
With the fins clipped, the reactor finally went critical and produced plutonium. But when it was extracted, it didn't look right.
It should have been a lovely pink colour, and ours was a disgusting looking greenish brown. So something had to be done about that. But we had no recovery process, so a decision was taken at the time to add some calcium to the plutonium fluoride, cook it up in a reaction vessel and see what happened. And this was the last stage before getting plutonium metal. I broke down the reaction vessel myself personally, opened it up, scrambled around amongst calcium fluoride, see if I could find anything, and there I found a piece of plutonium about this size, but the size of a 50p piece, 132 grams, and that was our very first piece. So all this vast industrial complex and 6 years of activity came down to 132 grams of plutonium.
Hinton's team had met the impossible deadline, just. Now the plutonium was transported down the highways and byways of Britain to its destination in the Thames Valley. The most valuable substance ever produced in Britain was carried in a sealed drum, lashed to the back of an army lorry. There was no police escort.
We received a message that Windscale will be sending the first consignment of the plutonium to us here. The lorry drove up outside the main entrance to the building. I stepped forward, suitably protected, with my equipment. And my task was to, first of all, to declare, for instance, that the surfaces that people would have to walk on were free from contamination, and also the external surface of the drum was free from contamination. I checked with a Geiger, this time looking for gamma radiation, the outside of the container. I detected a certain amount of radiation, not a lot, but enough to suggest that it did in fact contain some radioactive material. I then turned round to the chief and told him, formally as it were, that the material could be moved into the building, which was known as A1. A couple of chaps came forward, lifted the container off, ceremoniously took it into the building, took it in. I followed on behind it, just in case for some reason or other there might have been some accident, but nevertheless it was belt and braces, if you like, and it was taken then and placed in one of the laboratories in A1. It was then opened up. I actually opened the lock, lifted the lid up. No contamination was measured, which frankly was a little bit of a surprise because it's a highly active material, plutonium. And of course there was always the problem in the back of all our minds about a phenomenon called criticality.
If one has two pieces of radioactive material, let's say plutonium, which are quite stable, quite safe on their own, but they're subcritical, but the total mass when put together would be supercritical. Now if we brought those together and they came close enough together, there would be a spontaneous fission takes place and a burst of neutrons would occur. And this would be extremely hazardous to anybody who was in the immediate locality and could cause harm to those some distance away.
So far, the scientists had only been working with small amounts of plutonium. Now it was time to make the two hemispheres which together would form the actual core of the bomb. The plutonium was loaded into a glove box, and the individual pieces were placed into a crucible to be melted. The theory said that the amounts would still be safe, or subcritical, but theory and practice are two different things.
But I noticed in one of the boxes where plutonium was being melted, there was a nice blue halo, something like a blue light. And I thought to myself, my God, criticality! That was the first thing that came to my mind. So I quickly whipped along the corridor, I spoke to one or two people.
It was too late for anybody to do anything, because if we're going to have a critical reaction, those were there, and that was it. Undoubtedly, the man at the box face would have been killed, and several others would have been rather badly hurt. But the flame died away, and the casting proceeded. And the first core was made, the first half core was made. At that stage, I think most of us felt that, well, the job was done. And I had arrived home and see my wife, as I say, for the first time for a few days. And I received a call that two operatives and the two plutonium hemispheres were trapped inside door B. We had the result of several years' work trapped behind a steel door. And attempts to move the doors were absolutely hopeless. We just couldn't move them at all.
The worker, with half a critical mass in each hand, was eventually squeezed out, and the team retired to the pub. But with time running out, Penney now faced the nightmare of entrusting his precious plutonium to a 10,000-mile flight. It was time to call on the RAF.
Penney was a very informal man, and he wandered into my office one day and sat down and said, look, since this is going to be an RAF bomb, I think you should do the radioactive assembly at Monte Bello. And I swallowed hard and said, yes, that's fine. Then he said, this is one of the most important consignments ever to leave the United Kingdom. And I'd like you to be responsible for making all the arrangements for getting it from the safes out here to Monte Bello.
Roland's most important consignment was driven away from Aldermaston in 2 staff cars. As the impressive convoy navigated the back roads in the heart of the countryside en route to London, the lead car broke down. The driver called Aldermaston and was told he would have to press on regardless.
It was an interesting operations order because in the service you have to allow for some contingencies. One of the contingencies I looked at was the possibility of the aircraft crashing with the material on board or having to ditch in the sea. And so the plutonium was in large containers and they'd been made so they would float. And so one of the procedures, if we were going to ditch or crash on land, was to jump out on parachutes, clutching these materials, and if we landed in the sea, we ignored the sharks.
The sharks were to be disappointed. Roland's cargo arrived safely, and the scientists at last took delivery of the simple wooden case containing a neutron initiator and the plutonium core.
I think that was the most hazardous part of the experiment because the meteorological conditions were such that the wind was blowing essentially from South Africa and there were huge waves.
For safety, Penney had designed the bomb so that the core could be kept separate from the rest until the last possible moment. These pictures, top secret until they were specially declassified for this program, show for the first time a plutonium core being lowered into the heart of an atomic bomb. For Eddie Howes, the loading was a heart-stopping affair.
Come the night, we were told that we'd got to keep out of the hold because they were going to do the loading. And our cabins were, I think, alongside. And we could hear what was going on, but we couldn't see. They were lowering slowly the core into the bomb. And as they were going down, so they were recording what neutrons were being produced. And we could hear this voice saying, down, down, no, stop, stop, go up a bit, down again, and this went on for hours and hours. Obviously it wasn't as long as that, but it seemed like hours until it all went quiet. So we assumed it had been loaded successfully, and we were still alive, so we were quite happy.
And HMS Plym comes to the end of her final voyage.
Churchill had insisted the bomb be tested in the hold of a ship to see what would happen if the Russians were to sail such a ship into a British port.
And Dr. Penney gives the order for the weapon to be fired at 8 o'clock next morning.
We were told this is the D-Day, assuming the weather was all right, and the ship was more or less stripped of all its complement except one or two who were going to power the boat and one officer, and it came down to then just John Challenge and myself.
Well, firstly, we had to put the detonators in, which was a unit about as big as a coconut, a small coconut. We put these in clips round the bottom. There were 32 of them. And then we had to connect up the cable. We had two firing circuits. The idea was that in the event of there being a detonator failure in one system, the detonator in the other system would take its place. 64 cables to connect up. Quite a long and tedious business. It was at that moment when we began to realise that you were playing about with a nuclear bomb.
Connect the batteries. 1, 2. Next, the switches. 1, 2, 3. Now the key. Turning the circuit into position to fire. Inside headquarters, the rest of the control party are waiting at their instruments.
There was a master safety plug which had to be put in at the control room. My job was to carry this plug back to the control room and to hand it to the man in charge of firing. As I handed it to him, he said, "Well, I'm glad you remembered to bring that."
Can we have the all-ready signals, please? Mr. Abercrombie, please. Thank you.
Every man has to strip and change. They put on fine woolen underclothes.
I went into a bunker alongside the control room where I joined the others who were stationed at H1, and they'd finished their job and were now waiting for the firing.
Minus 1.5 minutes.
Well, of course, I was standing with my back to the explosion, eyes covered, hands over eyes.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
So when the countdown went to 3, 2, 1, 0, and then there was the flash, so we knew it'd gone off, and our immediate thing was to run outside, and we all rushed outside to get a view of what we could see, and we stood out there and waited for the shockwave to reach us.
I turned round and looked at the explosion, and it didn't look very impressive to me.
It didn't look like a mushroom, it just looked like a smoke going up, and then as the wind caught it, it changed direction and went one way, and then it kept going up, then it changed direction and went the other way, so it looked like a giant Z of smoke in the sky.
Curiosity was that although on television you always hear the bang immediately the burst goes off, in real life there are 30 seconds or so dead silence. It's all very eerie to see this event taking place in complete silence. And they say the total impression on me was, I don't think that's very good.
But what no one saw at the time were the first terrifying microseconds of the explosion. Dr. Penney had succeeded in the job he never wanted to do. It was as powerful as anything the Americans had achieved so far.
Turn away. Do not remove goggles or face burst until 10 seconds after the first.
But just 3 weeks later, the Americans exploded the world's first thermonuclear weapon. 1,000 times more powerful. But Britain was now fully committed to the nuclear club. By 1957, she had tested her own hydrogen bomb, and the Americans finally decided that the special relationship was worth reviving after all. Bill Penney had returned from Monte Bello to face a new problem: publicity.
And now, Dr. Penney, what is your next move?
Well, I have to send in my report to the government. When I've done that, I shall have a short holiday, and I hope to play some golf.
Can you, sir, at this stage tell us anything at all about Monte Bello?
No, not at all.
Closed book at the moment?
Yes, completely.
It was in the paper. And we went to London, and everybody pointed at him. You've seen it here. And so he said, come on, we can't stand this, and we went home. Children were told to eat up quickly. They finished our food and we all went back home as fast as we could go.
Before he died, Penney burned all his personal papers. He had done his duty for his country, but he couldn't bear to be remembered only as a bomb maker in a world apparently hell-bent on a nuclear arms race.